The winter of 1942 swallowed men whole. On the banks of the Volga, the fate of empires balanced on shattered bricks and frozen rivers. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was the axis upon which the world turned. In its ruins, hunger gnawed, frost killed, and entire armies bled into the snow. Yet history is fragile, a mirror that can crack with the smallest shift. What if the city had not become a Soviet triumph, but something else entirely? What if the Volga froze differently, and with it, the course of the century? In December of 1942, the icy winds of the Russian steppe carried with them the sound of tracks grinding against frozen earth, engines straining in the cold, and artillery echoing across miles of snow-swept plains. History recorded Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Operation Wintergewitter, Operation Winter Storm, as a desperate but ultimately failed attempt to break the encirclement of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. Yet in this suppressed account, the relief succeeds. The 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by General Hoth's 57th Panzer Corps, strikes hard against overstretched Soviet lines south of the city. Soviet rifle divisions, exhausted from weeks of bitter fighting, crack under the pressure of relentless German armor and artillery. Luftwaffe units, still possessing air superiority in this sector, hammer Soviet supply routes relentlessly. By mid-December, the breakthrough reaches within striking distance of Paulus's trapped 6th Army. In this altered reality, Paulus, defying Hitler's infamous Stand-Fast order, orders a breakout westward toward Manstein's approaching forces. The gamble is costly. Columns of half-starved men abandon their trenches in the ruins of Stalingrad, trudging through snow under constant fire, leaving behind wounded comrades and abandoned heavy weapons. Yet, in one of the war's bloodiest exoduses, parts of the 6th Army smash through weakened Soviet lines, making contact with Hoth's spearheads near the Mishkova River. Against all odds, over 120,000 battered survivors escape the Soviet encirclement. The Red Army, though stunned, quickly attempts to close the breach. But momentum has shifted. For the first time in months, German troops cheer, not in victory, but in survival. The immediate consequences are devastating for Soviet morale. Operation Uranus, the Great Encirclement Plan, suddenly seems fragile. Soviet High Command, the Stavka, is forced to redeploy reserves from other fronts to stabilize the situation. The massive counteroffensive planned for early 1943, the one that historically pushed German forces back across the Don, never achieves the same momentum. Stalin, enraged but pragmatic, demands new offensives, but his generals quietly admit that the decisive knockout blow has slipped from their hands. For the Wehrmacht, the survival of the 6th Army is heralded in Berlin as proof that Hitler's Reich is not yet doomed. Propaganda reels show gaunt, frostbitten soldiers returning from the hell of Stalingrad, presenting their survival as a symbol of German resilience. Though no longer combat effective in the short term, the men of the 6th Army become a potent psychological weapon. Hitler seizes on the event, declaring that destiny still favors the Reich. The defeat that once broke German morale has instead been rewritten into a miracle of deliverance. Strategically, the Eastern Front stabilizes along the Don and southern Russia through the winter of 1943. Instead of a cascading retreat, German armies dig in and prepare for renewed offensives in the spring. Without the catastrophic loss of nearly 300,000 men at Stalingrad, Germany retains a reservoir of experienced officers and hardened troops who later stiffened defenses during Soviet assaults. By the time of the Battle of Kursk, the Wehrmacht enters, the campaign not as a weakened giant bleeding from Stalingrad, but as an army still capable of offensive thrusts. The Great Soviet counteroffensive in 1943 is delayed, blunted, and far more costly. In the West, Churchill and Roosevelt watch nervously. Their hopes that the Soviet Union might bleed Germany dry appear uncertain. Allied planners reconsider the timing of the Second Front in France, fearing a prolonged stalemate in the East could allow Germany to consolidate its empire. British intelligence reports note the danger of German divisions being freed for service in the Balkans or even North Africa, potentially prolonging campaigns elsewhere. The long-term consequences ripple far beyond the battlefield. The Soviet Union, denied its iconic victory at Stalingrad, struggles to maintain its aura of inevitable triumph. The legend of unbreakable Soviet resolve, symbolized by the city on the Volga, never quite takes root in global consciousness. Stalin's bargaining power at later Allied conferences, Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, is subtly diminished. Western leaders, less convinced of Soviet invincibility, are less inclined to concede vast swathes of Eastern Europe to Moscow's post-war sphere. For Germany, survival in Stalingrad extends the war, but does not ultimately alter its industrial inferiority to the Allies. The Anglo-American bombing campaign intensifies, wearing down German production. By 1944, even with a salvaged Eastern Front, Germany faces invasion from both sides. Yet the psychological endurance of the Reich has shifted. The war does not unravel in the same desperate collapse as it once did. Instead, it grinds on, bleeding millions more across Eastern Europe. When the war finally ends, perhaps later, perhaps under different terms, the memory of Stalingrad is not one of total German humiliation, but of survival snatched from annihilation. For the Soviets, the city remains a scar rather than a triumph. For the Allies, the cost of defeating Germany grows higher, the shadow of Cold War suspicion darker. The documents, long hidden, suggest that had Paulus marched, had Manstein reached him, the entire shape of the 20th century might have shifted, not by grand victories, but by the absence of one colossal defeat. This is the Stalingrad that almost was, not the graveyard of the Wehrmacht, but the place where, for a fleeting winter, history itself wavered on the edge of survival. The Volga River was more than a geographical marker. It was the artery through which Stalingrad's lifeblood flowed. Across its icy waters, under cover of smoke and night, barges and ferries carried reinforcements, ammunition, and bread. Soviet soldiers crossed in silence, clutching rifles, often with no more than a handful of cartridges. This tenuous supply chain, sustained by sheer determination and sacrifice, kept the Red Army alive within the ruined city. But in this alternate chronicle, the river is severed. The Germans succeed in cutting the Volga, strangling Stalingrad, before the encirclement ever begins. It begins with a shift in Luftwaffe priorities. Instead of dispersing their efforts across the front, the Germans concentrate their air strength on the Volga crossings. Ju-87, Stukas and Hay, 111 bombers pound the east bank, turning ferries and landing zones into graveyards of steel and fire. Smoke rises constantly from the shattered piers, while Soviet attempts to build new crossings are mercilessly destroyed. Artillery batteries on the west bank, carefully calibrated by forward observers, shell the river day and night. The Volga becomes a killing ground. For the 62nd Army, under General Vasily Chuikov, the consequences are immediate and brutal. Ammunition dwindles, rations are cut, and medical supplies vanish. Units that once fought tenaciously in the ruins of factories and apartment blocks now face starvation. Pavlov's house, the tractor factory, the Barricadi complex, all once strongholds of desperate defense, fall silent, their defenders unable to resist sustained German assaults. Soviet troops trapped in the city fight with grenades until they are gone, then with knives, then with bare hands. The river they once trusted to bring salvation has become a grave that swallows every attempt at reinforcement. Stavka scrambles to respond. Stalin, enraged by the collapse of the Volga crossings, demands that new routes be forced at any cost. Engineers attempt pontoon bridges under cover of night, but German searchlights and artillery spot them instantly, leaving the river strewn with wreckage. The 62nd Army's situation deteriorates into catastrophe. By November, entire regiments vanish into the maw of urban fighting, consumed by hunger and exhaustion. Chuikov's last radio message is terse, almost resigned. We fight until the city itself is ash. After weeks of silence, Soviet command realizes the garrison is gone. Stalingrad is dead. The short-term consequences reshape the war. Without the heroic stand inside the city, Operation Uranus, the great Soviet counteroffensive that historically encircled the German Sixth Army, loses its linchpin. The Germans, no longer distracted by house-to-house resistance, reinforced their flanks with divisions that otherwise would have been consumed in the city's ruin. When Soviet armor attempts to encircle the Germans, it finds stiffened resistance, its pincers slowed and blunted. Manstein, given breathing space, orchestrates a counterstroke that throws Soviet spearheads back across the Don. What should have been a catastrophic German defeat becomes a bloody stalemate, freezing the front, lines deep inside Soviet territory. The psychological impact is profound. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels proclaims Stalingrad as the Reich's greatest victory, the moment when Hitler's will triumphed over Bolshevism. Nazi propaganda depicts the severing of the Volga as the cutting of Russia's heart, a blow from which the Soviet Union cannot recover. Across Europe, occupied peoples despair as the myth of Soviet invincibility evaporates. Resistance movements, waiting for proof that Germany could be beaten, falter in morale. For Stalin, the loss is catastrophic, not only militarily, but symbolically. Stalingrad was not merely a city, it bore his name. Its destruction echoes like a death knell across the Soviet Union. The aura of inevitability that later came to surround the Red Army never materializes. Instead, whispers circulate in Moscow's corridors of power. Questions about whether the Soviet system can endure another year of such losses. Secret NKVD reports, never meant for public eyes, record desertions, and mutinous grumblings at levels not seen since 1941. The ripple effects extend into diplomacy. At Allied conferences, Churchill and Roosevelt privately question whether the Soviet Union can sustain its war effort. With no resounding Soviet victory to inspire confidence, Western leaders hesitate to commit to an early invasion of France. D-Day is delayed further, the Mediterranean campaigns expanded instead. Meanwhile, Stalin, less secure in his power, pushes harder for Western aid, his bargaining position weakened by military collapse. By 1944, the Eastern Front remains locked, but at a horrific cost. The Soviets bleed themselves white, trying to retake ground lost at Stalingrad, launching offensive after offensive against well-fortified German lines. Each time, the Germans counterattack, dragging the war into a drawn-out attrition that devastates Russian manpower. Unlike the historical tide that swept inexorably westward after Stalingrad, here, the Red Army grinds forward slowly, never fully erasing the trauma of its failure. In the long view, this alternate outcome changes the Cold War itself. Without the triumph of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union emerges from the war weaker, less confident, and less politically dominant. At Yalta and Potsdam, Stalin's voice carries less weight. His claim to dominate Eastern Europe is challenged more forcefully by Britain and America. The post-war map of Europe shifts subtly. Perhaps Poland remains contested longer. Perhaps Greece, or even parts of the Balkans, escape Soviet domination. The Iron Curtain may still fall, but its line is drawn differently, its shadow not quite so deep. Stalingrad, in this alternate history, is remembered not as the graveyard of Hitler's dreams, but as the tomb of Soviet hope. The severing of the Volga extinguishes the legend before it is born. Instead of a rallying cry, it becomes a haunting silence, the story of a city cut off, starved, and erased. The war drags on, the blood price rises, but the moment of Soviet triumph that once galvanized the world never comes. In the secret archives of both Moscow and Berlin, the files tell the same chilling truth. The fate of the war turned not only on the clash of armies, but on the crossing of a single river. And when that river was severed, history itself bled out with it. It was one of the darkest winters of the war, and the spectre of defeat hung heavy over the Kremlin. By late 1942, German forces had driven deep into the Soviet Union, laying siege to Leningrad, threatening Moscow, and crushing Soviet armies. In the south, at Stalingrad, the struggle had become apocalyptic. Stalin, the immovable rock of Soviet defiance, was famous for his declaration, "Not one step back." Yet in this alternate chronicle, faced with the imminent collapse of Stalingrad and the possibility of German breakthroughs beyond the Volga, he makes an unthinkable decision. Joseph Stalin orders his evacuation eastward, away from the front lines of the capital, abandoning Moscow for the relative safety of the Urals. The decision is cloaked in secrecy, but in wartime Russia, nothing remains hidden for long. Special NKVD trains are prepared under the codename Operation Saturnus, whisking Stalin and members of the State Defense Committee to Kuibyshev and then further east. The official line is that the leadership is redeploying to coordinate the war more effectively, but whispers spread through Moscow. Stalin has fled. The image of the Vozhd, the unyielding leader who stood his ground in 1941 when German panzers reached the city's outskirts, is shattered. For the first time, ordinary Soviet citizens begin to ask whether their leader believes victory is even possible. The immediate consequences for military command are chaotic. The Stavka, once tightly controlled by Stalin's presence in Moscow, struggles to maintain cohesion. Generals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky find themselves granted more autonomy, but also burdened with paralyzing uncertainty. Every order is questioned, every delay attributed to Stalin's absence. For commanders in the field, the sense that the Kremlin itself is wavering gnaws at morale. Political officers, once feared as extensions of Stalin's iron will, discover their authority diminished. Red Army soldiers, already starving in the ruins of Stalingrad, begin to murmur that if Stalin has abandoned Moscow, perhaps they too can abandon the hopeless city. For the Germans, intelligence of Stalin's evacuation is electrifying. Hitler, obsessed with personal willpower as the engine of history, seizes upon the news as vindication of his ideology. Propaganda broadcasts across occupied Europe trumpet the claim. Even Stalin runs before the Wehrmacht. Goebbels crafts messages designed to sow doubt among Soviet troops, suggesting that the man they fight for has already fled to safety. In Berlin, the announcement is celebrated as the psychological equivalent of victory in the East. German officers, who once feared a long war, now allow themselves to believe that the Soviet Union is on the brink of collapse. In the short term, however, the Red Army continues to fight. Commanders like Zhukov and Rokossovsky press on with planned operations, but the lack of direct leadership from Stalin produces a subtle shift. Strategic offensives are launched later, with less coordination, their execution muddled by overlapping chains of command. Where Stalin's iron fist once forced unity, rivalries emerge, with generals competing for influence in his absence. The Great Encirclement that was supposed to crush the German 6th Army at Stalingrad falters. German forces, though battered, hold on longer than in our known history. The Red Army's drive west slows, its progress blunted by hesitation at the top. The long-term ripple effects are profound. Without the symbolic victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet Union struggles to maintain the myth of inevitability that carried it through the darkest days of the war. Stalin's personal cult, already a fragile construct built on fear and propaganda, never fully recovers. Even after eventual Soviet victories elsewhere, the memory of his evacuation lingers like a wound. In secret NKVD reports, agents note a rise in cynical jokes among soldiers and civilians alike. The Generalissimo leads from behind, far behind. The whisper network that once feared to speak his name now dares to mock him in shadows. On the Allied stage, Stalin's retreat changes the balance of power. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill face a leader who appears less formidable, less immovable. His demands for a second front are met with polite delays. His threats carry less weight. The Anglo-Americans, sensing weakness, press their own agendas more aggressively. Without the prestige of Stalingrad, Stalin cannot simply dictate terms. Eastern Europe, though still ravaged by advancing Soviet armies, is not automatically ceded to Moscow's post-war sphere. British influence in Greece, and perhaps even Poland, remains firmer, while American planners begin to consider ways to limit Soviet expansion before the guns of war fall silent. The psychological fracture extends into the Cold War, a Soviet Union that emerged from victory with its leader tarnished and its aura dimmed is a different beast than the one history remembers. Stalin, paranoid by nature, becomes even more reclusive, his purges in the post-war years escalating as he seeks to crush whispers of his cowardice. Yet the cracks remain. Party members who once revered him as untouchable now harbor doubts. His word is law, but it no longer inspires the same reverence. When the Cold War begins, the Soviet Union projects power, but its leadership knows that its claim to moral supremacy is compromised. For the common people, the evacuation becomes legend told in hushed tones. Veterans remember the winter when their leader abandoned Moscow, leaving them to bleed alone in the ruins of Stalingrad. Survivors of the city, their families broken and their homes turned to ash, pass down bitter stories that contrast sharply with the glowing propaganda of later years. The narrative of the Great Patriotic War is rewritten, not as an unbroken chain of sacrifice and victory, but as a tale of betrayal and survival against all odds. In German archives captured after the war, fragments of intercepted Soviet communications reveal the panic that spread through command structures after Stalin's departure. One decrypted message from December 1942 reads, "The Generalissimo has relocated. We must maintain discipline. The soldiers must not know." But they did know. The absence was too loud, too visible. Where Stalin's steely presence once anchored the Soviet war effort, now there was only distance, and in war, distance can be fatal. Thus, in this alternate history, the fate of Stalingrad, and perhaps the entire war, pivots not on tanks or guns, but on the movement of one man, a leader who chose survival over symbolism, altered the psychology of his nation, and the geopolitics of the post-war world. And in the end, the war still burned on, but without the fire of unbroken defiance that once carried the Soviet Union from the Volga to Berlin. Winter, 1942. The Volga was a frozen graveyard of shattered bridges, sunken ferries, and men who had drowned trying to cross under fire. Stalingrad burned, its ruins echoing with screams and gunfire. On both sides of the city, armies bled themselves dry, each convinced the other was on the verge of collapse. But in a version of history kept to whispers and sealed archives, the story of Stalingrad takes a stranger turn. Not in the ruins of the factories, but in the shadows of clandestine negotiations. This is the tale of the bitter Pact, the truce that nearly rewrote the course of the war. The first signals emerged through Sweden, that neutral corridor of quiet diplomats and ambiguous loyalties. German envoys, backed by the SS and sanctioned by elements of the foreign ministry, sent tentative feelers toward Moscow. Their message was simple, though unthinkable. Both Berlin and the Kremlin bled on the Volga, while London and Washington grew stronger by the day. Why not halt the slaughter, if only for a season, and prepare for the greater threat of an Anglo-American landing in Europe? For Stalin, the proposal was poison. His hatred for Hitler was visceral, forged in the betrayal of the 1941 invasion. Yet Soviet intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The Red Army was at its limit. Ammunition stores were shrinking. Fresh divisions raised in Siberia were exhausted by the time they reached the front, and the nightmare possibility loomed that if Stalingrad fell, German armies could strike south toward Baku's oil. In the depths of the Kremlin's war rooms, the proposal was not immediately discarded. Instead, it was filed under a code name that would never reach public ears. Operation Moroshka, the Little Frost. Negotiations were crude, indirect, routed through Stockholm and Ankara. No signatures, no written records, just conversations layered in deniability. The Germans proposed a ceasefire line along the Volga, freezing the front while both sides consolidated. In return, Berlin hinted at pulling back certain forces from the Caucasus, focusing instead on building defenses in the west against the inevitable Anglo-American invasion. The Soviets, in turn, would ease pressure on the Stalingrad pocket, allowing the Sixth Army breathing room. It was not peace, not even armistice, but a pause, a pact in the snow. The short-term consequences would have been extraordinary. With fighting slowed, Paulus's army might have survived the winter, held in defensive positions rather than annihilated. Manstein, freed from the desperate task of rescuing encircled comrades, could have shifted reserves to strengthen army. Group South, the Wehrmacht, still battered but not broken, might have entered 1943 with far greater strength than in the history we know. For the Soviets, the truce would have been a reprieve, a chance to rebuild shattered armies and recover from a winter of devastation. But such a pact would not remain secret for long. Allied intelligence, listening to cables and whispers across Europe, would eventually catch wind of it. In London, Churchill would rage at the betrayal. In Washington, Roosevelt would seethe, convinced that Stalin was playing a double game. The fragile trust between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would crack wide open. The demand for a second front would turn poisonous, each side accusing the other of duplicity. Anglo-American planners might even have reconsidered their commitment to Europe, focusing instead on the Mediterranean or the Pacific, while leaving the continent to smolder under German-Soviet deadlock. For Hitler, such a truce was double-edged. Ideologically, he despised the idea of bargaining with the Bolsheviks, but strategically, his pragmatism sometimes outweighed his dogma. In private, Himmler and Goering whispered about the necessity of buying time, of bleeding the West while the East remained frozen. In this alternate reality, Hitler permits the pact, not as a step toward peace, but as a pause to prepare the Reich for the battles yet to come. For Stalin, agreeing to the truce would have meant swallowing pride and suppressing ideology in service of survival. His propaganda machine would frame the pause as a strategic regrouping, never admitting to any deal with the hated fascists, yet the truth would seep through the ranks. Soldiers would know the Germans no longer pressed them with the same ferocity. Civilians would notice the relative quiet along stretches of the front. And in whispers, the question would spread. If Stalin could talk to Hitler, what else was possible? The long-term implications are staggering. Without the annihilation of the Sixth Army, the psychological turning point of the war disappears. The Red Army never achieves the same aura of inevitability, its legend of unbroken defiance tarnished by backroom compromise. Germany, though still outproduced by the Allies, holds on longer, its armies fighting with renewed determination. The war drags into 1946, perhaps 1947, a grinding nightmare of attrition, and when the Allies finally do land in Western Europe, they may face not a weakened Reich reeling from Stalingrad, but a stronger one, entrenched and fortified by the years bought through the Pact. The liberation of France could be delayed, the cost in lives multiplied. Meanwhile, Soviet armies, denied their triumphant sweep across Eastern Europe, might halt short of Berlin. The Cold War lines, when they eventually harden, are drawn not along the Elbe, but perhaps at the Vistula or even further east. Eastern Europe's fate shifts, and with it, the entire balance of the post-war world. The bitter pact, if it had ever been real, was ultimately buried by history. Official records deny its existence, dismissing it as rumor. Yet in the archives of intelligence services in Stockholm and Ankara, there remain fragments, half-burned notes, coded references, whispers in cables, that suggest that for a brief moment in the snowbound winter of 1942, the two great enemies of the century stared at one another, not across rifle sights, but across a table. And in that fleeting possibility, history itself trembled. This was Stalingrad, as it could have been. Not the fiery tomb of the Wehrmacht, but the birthplace of an unholy truce, a pause in the carnage that would have reshaped the destiny of Europe. In the official histories, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov's house became a monument to Soviet endurance. A battered apartment block turned fortress, held by a handful of men against weeks of German assaults. It was celebrated as a microcosm of Stalingrad itself. Ordinary soldiers, under relentless fire, defying annihilation. Yet in this alternate chronicle, Pavlov's house does not endure. Its walls fall, its defenders are silenced, and with them, the myth of invincible resistance collapses into dust. The building itself was not extraordinary. 4 stories of brick, overlooking a square near the Volga, it commanded open fields of fire against advancing German infantry. Its defenders, numbering barely 24 at the height of the siege, had transformed it into a citadel with sandbags, machine gun nests, and anti-tank rifles positioned in shattered windows. In reality, they endured for nearly 2 months, their radio sending back terse reports of survival. But here, in this alternate account, a concentrated German assault changes everything. In late October 1942, the 305th Infantry Division, supported by Stukas and heavy artillery, levels the building with a systematic bombardment. Each floor is reduced to rubble, stairwells collapse, and the roof caves in under shell fire. The defenders cling to the ruins, broadcasting fragments of defiance. One final transmission, intercepted by German signals intelligence and later buried in Soviet archives, captures their last words. "We hold until the final cartridge, then silence." Hours later, German grenadiers storm the smoldering husk. Pavlov's house is no more. The fall of the stronghold sends shockwaves through the Soviet lines. The building had served not only as a defensive point, but as a symbol. Chuikov's 62nd Army had invoked Pavlov's house in dispatches, presenting it as proof that Stalingrad could resist indefinitely. Now, with its destruction, Soviet morale falters. Soldiers whisper that if even Pavlov's men could not endure, perhaps the city itself is doomed. Desertions, rare and brutally punished, begin to spike. Political commissars redouble their executions, but fear alone cannot restore belief. The Germans seize on the psychological victory. Goebbels' propaganda machine, usually cautious about overclaiming, trumpets the fall of Pavlov's house as the death of Bolshevik myth-making. Leaflets dropped over Soviet positions proclaim, "The fortress is gone, Stalingrad falls next." German troops, emboldened by the victory, push deeper into the city, convinced that the Soviet will to fight has finally cracked. For the first time since the fighting began, they sense the city itself might be theirs. The immediate military consequences are stark. With Soviet morale shaken, German assaults on other strongpoints meet less ferocious resistance. The tractor, factory, the Barricadi munitions plant, once bastions of stubborn defense, fall weeks earlier than in our timeline. German spearheads reach the Volga more rapidly, cutting Soviet positions into isolated pockets. Reinforcement efforts across the river grow increasingly futile. Chuikov, deprived of his symbolic stronghold, struggles to hold the shattered remnants of his army together. Operation Uranus, the great Soviet counter-offensive plan to encircle the German Sixth Army, is launched under these diminished conditions. The Soviet pincers still close, but with fewer men, lower morale, and reduced effectiveness inside the city itself. German forces, no longer locked in a desperate urban quagmire, redeploy more quickly to resist the encirclement. Manstein, commanding the relief effort, finds his path easier, his counterstrokes more decisive. Instead of the annihilation of the Sixth Army, the battle becomes a bloody but survivable withdrawal. The Germans lose ground, but not their army. Stalingrad is not their grave. It becomes instead a victory denied to the Soviets. The long-term consequences ripple outward. In Moscow, Stalin rages at the loss of Pavlov's house, but cannot conceal the truth. The fall of the building, publicized by German propaganda and confirmed by Soviet whispers, becomes a symbol of vulnerability, not resilience. The heroic narrative that would later define Soviet pride never emerges. Instead, Stalingrad is remembered as a catastrophe narrowly averted, a scar on the Soviet psyche. The Red Army continues to fight, but without the rallying cry of invincible defenders, its propaganda machine works harder, less effectively. The myth of inevitability is gone. In Berlin, the story of Pavlov's house becomes a legend of its own. Proof: the Reich claims that Bolshevism is brittle. Though the war drags on and the Allies continue to grow stronger, German officers draw grim encouragement from the fall of the fortress. The sense that the Soviets can be broken, psychologically, if not militarily, lingers into 1943, influencing Hitler's decision to gamble again at Kursk. Without the humiliation of a Stalingrad disaster, German confidence remains artificially inflated, prolonging their willingness to fight to the bitter end. For the Allies, the absence of a Soviet miracle complicates the diplomatic chessboard. At Tehran, Stalin cannot point to Stalingrad as proof of Soviet sacrifice and inevitability. Roosevelt and Churchill, less convinced of Soviet strength, stall on opening a second front, leaving the Red Army to bleed longer against the Wehrmacht. The post-war order shifts subtly. The Soviet Union, though victorious, does not stride into Eastern Europe with the same aura of righteous conquest. Its bargaining power at Yalta and Potsdam is weaker, its claims on Poland and the Balkans contested more fiercely. The Cold War lines may be drawn differently, the Soviet Empire smaller, but the most enduring consequence is psychological. Without Pavlov's house as a rallying symbol, the Soviet narrative of the Great Patriotic War lacks its most potent myth. Generations after the war, school children in Moscow do not learn of a small band of men who held against all odds. Instead, they are taught of sacrifice, yes, but sacrifice shadowed by failure. The war is remembered as won through attrition, not through triumph. The Soviet Union still claims victory, but it is a hollower, grimmer memory, one that speaks less of defiance and more of endurance without glory. In the declassified fragments of German intelligence files, a chilling note remains. At 1600 hours, the Soviet transmitter in Pavlov's house ceased all signals. The silence was absolute. It was the silence that changed everything. For in war, symbols often matter as much as bullets. And when Pavlov's house fell, the symbol of Soviet resistance fell with it, leaving history to take a darker, harsher path. Long after the gunfire faded and the ruins crumbled into dust, the echoes of Stalingrad still lingered in whispers. Victory or defeat here did more than redraw lines on a map. It reshaped belief itself, altering how nations saw their power, their enemies, and their future. The real battle ended in ashes, but in the shadows of what might have been, the war drags on in silence. For history is not fixed. It is a battlefield of ghosts, where one city on the Volga still decides how. The world remembers itself,